The terminal was alive with movement, a symphony of hurried footsteps, rolling suitcases, and muffled conversations. Bright screens flickered with departure updates, announcing flights bound for every corner of the world. Madrid's international airport was no different from any other major hub, efficient, grand, and indifferent. Vinícius Júnior walked through the terminal, earbuds in, lost in the rhythm of his playlist. His hoodie was pulled over his head, his black joggers comfortable, and his sneakers pristine, a simple yet stylish outfit, perfect for a long flight. His first-class ticket was tucked securely in his hand. The journey ahead was just another trip, another transition between stadiums, games, and obligations. And yet, something was off. The first time he noticed it was at the luxury store. He had only stopped to glance at the window display, nothing more, but the sales associate inside froze, eyes locked on him. A fraction of a second later, she turned away sharply, pretending to adjust a mannequin. A man standing a few feet away from him, dressed just as casually, received no such reaction. Vinícius exhaled slowly and kept walking. It happened again at the coffee stand. The barista served the man in front of him with a warm smile but barely looked at him when it was his turn. Her movements rushed and detached, as if hoping he would take his cup and disappear. These were small things, subtle, easy to dismiss, if they hadn't happened so many times before. Still, he kept moving. The check-in counter was smooth. His name on the reservation ensured efficiency. He barely exchanged words with the agent as she printed his boarding pass. But as he turned toward the security checkpoint, he caught the sideways glance of an airport staff member. Just a glance. Quick. Assessing. Calculating. Then, they turned away as if they hadn't been looking at all. A slow tightening sensation settled in his chest. He had felt this before. At restaurants, at high-end stores, even at events where he had been personally invited. That quiet, familiar evaluation. Like he was being measured against something unseen. Like he didn't quite belong. Still, he kept moving. Approaching the priority lane for first-class boarding, he adjusted his backpack and slipped his phone into his pocket. The process would be quick. He would be on the plane in no time. That's when he saw the security officer standing near the boarding gate. The man was watching him. It wasn't just a glance this time. It was a direct, unwavering stare, neutral, but piercing. Vinícius pretended not to notice. He had played in front of thousands, been under the scrutiny of millions, faced relentless pressure on and off the field. A single stare shouldn't mean anything. And yet, his steps slowed just a fraction. The officer leaned in slightly, murmuring something to a boarding attendant. The woman at the counter nodded, her eyes flicking toward Vinícius before quickly looking away. A cold awareness spread through him. He could already tell what was coming. And yet, still, he kept moving. The first-class boarding lane was almost empty. A well-dressed older couple stood ahead, chatting quietly. Behind them, a businessman in a tailored suit scrolled through his phone, shifting his weight impatiently. One by one, they approached the attendant, handed over their boarding passes, and were waved through without question. No hesitation. No second glances. When it was Vinícius' turn, he stepped forward smoothly, his grip firm on his first-class ticket. The boarding attendant didn't reach for it. Instead, she hesitated, just for a second, but long enough for him to notice. She didn't look at his name, his seat assignment, or his flight details. She looked at him. Her fingers twitched on the counter as if unsure what to do next. Then, in a voice too flat, too practiced, she said, "Sir, this line is for first-class passengers only." The words hit him like a slow-moving wave, crashing and spreading before he could fully register them. He blinked, shifting his weight slightly. She hadn't even checked his ticket. A small silence hung between them, thick and suffocating. Calmly, Vinícius held out the boarding pass. No reaction. She didn't take it. Instead, she glanced at the security officer, the same one who had been watching him earlier. It was subtle, just a flick of her eyes, but it said everything. Vinícius exhaled slowly, keeping his expression neutral. Not again. Not another restaurant turning him away. Not another store clerk pretending not to see him. Not another moment where his presence alone became a question mark. "Check my ticket," he said, his voice measured, steady. The woman hesitated again. Behind him, the line had grown. He could feel the impatient shifting of bodies, the subtle glances, the unspoken curiosity. The security officer took a single step closer. Just close enough to be felt. Vinícius clenched his jaw, keeping his posture loose but unwavering. He wasn't moving. The businessman behind him cleared his throat, checking his watch. Then, finally, the woman reached for the ticket, but her movements were slow, reluctant. As if she were looking for a reason to say no. Her eyes darted across the details on the boarding pass. The hesitation in her face didn't change. If anything, it deepened. Like she was waiting to find something wrong. Like she still couldn't believe he belonged there. Then, she saw it. The first-class seat assignment. His name, clear and undeniable. A flicker of realization crossed her features. The muscles in her jaw tensed, as if trying to swallow something bitter. For the first time, she met his gaze directly. She had no excuse. No reason. But the damage was already done. Vinícius didn't move. He just stood there, letting the weight of the moment settle, his expression unreadable. The woman cleared her throat. Too late. With a forced politeness, she finally said, "You may proceed." But it wasn't permission. It was reluctance. Vinícius took the ticket back, slipping it into his pocket. His fingers curled into a slow, deliberate fist before relaxing again. Behind him, the businessman sighed in relief, stepping forward to be checked in without issue. The security officer didn't step away. He just stood there, still watching, still waiting, as if expecting Vinícius to be the problem, as if waiting for him to prove their doubts right. But he wouldn't. He wouldn't give them what they wanted. Without another word, he walked through the gate, feeling every stare on his back. And yet, the weight that settled in his chest wasn't anger. It was something heavier, something colder, something far too familiar. As Vinícius walked through the boarding gate, the tightness in his chest didn't ease. He kept his posture relaxed, his movements controlled, just like he always did. He had learned long ago that reacting wasn't an option. Not the way he wanted to. Not the way the fire inside him begged him to. But as he stepped onto the jet bridge, away from the stares, the whispers, the expectations, his mind didn't let it go. Because this wasn't new. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a story he had lived too many times before. A memory flickered in his mind, a restaurant in Paris. The way the hostess had barely glanced at him before saying the place was fully booked, only for him to see empty tables stretching across the dining floor. Another memory, a luxury store in Milan. How the salesperson had followed him through the aisles, subtly but constantly, as if waiting for him to slip something into his pocket. The worst part? He had kept quiet both times. He had let it go. Because that's what you're supposed to do, right? Keep walking. Keep your head down. Don't give them a reason. You have to be twice as good to be treated like you belong. His mother's words echoed in his mind, a lesson drilled into him since childhood. She had never spoken them with bitterness, just acceptance. A truth passed down from generations before him. But no matter how much success he found, no matter how high he climbed, moments like this reminded him that, to some people, he would always be a question mark. A presence that needed to be explained. A man in a hoodie, holding a first-class ticket, but somehow still out of place. His jaw clenched as he stepped into the plane, the cool blast of the air conditioning hitting his skin. The flight attendants greeted him with polite smiles, their voices smooth, rehearsed. "Good evening, Mr. Júnior. Right this way." No hesitation. No doubt. Because they knew his name. Because they had been trained to serve. Because, inside this plane, he was exactly where he was supposed to be. But outside, he was a suspect. Outside, his presence required verification. As he walked toward his seat, he tried to push it down, the frustration, the exhaustion. But it wasn't just the incident itself. It was the pattern. The way it kept happening. The way it would keep happening. Because no matter how far he had come, no matter how much he had achieved, the world still saw him a certain way. And maybe it always would. Vinícius sank into his first-class seat, stretching his legs slightly as he exhaled. The cushioned comfort beneath him should have helped ease the weight on his chest, but it didn't. He glanced around the cabin. The businessman from the boarding line was a few rows ahead, already engrossed in his phone. A woman in designer sunglasses sipped champagne, flipping through a glossy magazine. None of them had any idea what had just happened outside that gate. To them, he was just another passenger. But to the people back there, the boarding agent, the security officer, the others who had watched in silence, he was something else. A doubt. A hesitation. A question mark. He reached for his phone and unlocked it. A reflex. But instead of opening his messages, his fingers hovered over the camera app. He could still feel the weight of the security officer's stare. The coldness of the boarding agent's tone. This wasn't the first time. And it wouldn't be the last. For a second, he considered letting it go. He had played this game before. He knew how the world worked. He knew that speaking up often led to deflection. Excuses. Gaslighting. "Oh, I'm sure it was just a mistake." "Are you sure it was about race?" "You're being too sensitive." The exhaustion of it all made his shoulders feel heavier than any defender who had ever tried to take him down. What would be the point? Would anything really change? His finger hovered over the phone screen. A long breath in. A slow breath out. Then, just before he could convince himself to lock the screen and forget about it, a movement caught his eye. A man across the aisle. Late 40s. Sharp suit. Silver hair. He was looking at Vinícius, not with curiosity, not with admiration, but with recognition. And then, as if deciding something, the man gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. A silent confirmation. A witness. A quiet way of saying, "I saw what happened." It was subtle, but it was enough. Vinícius swallowed, feeling a decision harden inside him. He wasn't going to stay silent. Not this time. Because this wasn't just about him. It was about everyone who had been stopped at a door they had the right to enter. Everyone who had been asked to prove they belonged in a place they had already earned. His hands moved before he could overthink it. The camera app opened. He tapped record. And he started speaking. The screen glowed in Vinícius' hand, the red recording icon blinking at the top. He stared into the camera for a second, collecting his thoughts. Then he spoke. "I just got on this plane. I'm sitting in first class. But before I got here, I had to go through something that happens to me and people like me all the time." His voice was calm, controlled. But there was weight behind each word. At the boarding gate, they looked at me and assumed I was in the wrong place. Before they even checked my ticket, they told me to move. Security was already watching me before I even got to the counter. And when I finally handed them my ticket, they hesitated, as if they were hoping to find a reason to say I didn't belong here. He paused, tightening his grip on the phone. "I've dealt with this before. But I want to ask, why does this keep happening? Why do people still look at someone like me and assume I shouldn't be here? And what happens to the people who don't have a platform to speak up about it?" His voice didn't rise. He didn't need to shout. The truth was loud enough. With a final exhale, he ended the recording. The second he did, doubt crept in. Would it matter? Would people actually listen, or would it be drowned out by excuses and empty justifications? But then, he remembered the nod. The man in the suit. The silent witness. The small, wordless confirmation that someone else had seen it too. That was all he needed. Without hesitation, he uploaded the video. Within seconds, notifications started flooding in. The phone barely had time to rest on his lap before it started buzzing non-stop. At first, it was just the usual, friends reacting, a few likes trickling in. But within minutes, the numbers exploded. Hundreds of comments. Thousands of shares. The retweets climbed so fast that the app froze for a second before catching up. Vinícius stared at the screen, watching as his words spread like wildfire. People were talking. Some were outraged. This is why we keep speaking up. They never see it until it happens to someone famous. "I can't believe this." Actually, I can. This happens every day. Why do black people always have to prove they belong? Others tried to downplay it. Maybe it was just a misunderstanding. Are you sure it was racism? Maybe she was just having a bad day. You're rich, bro. Who cares? That last one made his jaw tighten. As if money had ever been the issue. As if the weight of being doubted, of being seen as out of place in spaces he had earned, could be erased by a paycheck. His name was trending now. #WeBelong was trending. Then came the media. News outlets picked it up. Articles were being written in real time. Sports journalists, activists, public figures, they were all reacting. And then, a notification popped up. A statement from the airline. It was hollow, a typical corporate response. We take all concerns seriously and are committed to diversity and inclusion. We are investigating the incident and will take appropriate action. Nothing about what really happened. No direct accountability. Just damage control. Vinícius shook his head. They weren't sorry. They were just sorry people saw it. Vinícius leaned back in his seat, the glow of his phone illuminating his face in the dimly lit cabin. Outside the window, the airport runway stretched into the distance, but inside, his world had shrunk to the screen in his hands. The airline statement was spreading fast, but not in the way they had hoped. People weren't buying it. We take concerns seriously. That's it. No apology, no accountability. Commitment to diversity? Where was that commitment when they assumed he didn't belong? Classic PR nonsense. They only care because people saw it happen. More athletes were speaking up. More celebrities. More everyday people who had been through the same thing. But the most powerful responses weren't from the famous names. They were from the people whose stories had never made headlines. I work as a doctor, and security followed me through the hospital parking lot last week. They thought I was a car thief. I tried to board first class once. The agent told me, economy is the other line, before even looking at my ticket. My father has been a lawyer for 30 years. He still gets asked if he's really supposed to be in the VIP lounge. It wasn't just his story anymore. It was everyone's. And the airline was silent. No follow-up. No real apology. Just a corporate wall of nothing. They were waiting. Waiting for it to blow over. Waiting for the next scandal, the next viral controversy, the next distraction to take the world's attention somewhere else. Vinícius had seen this before. He knew how the cycle worked. And this time, he wasn't going to let them wait it out. With a slow, deliberate breath, he unlocked his phone and started typing. Vinícius stared at the blank text box on his phone screen, his thumbs hovering over the keyboard. He could let it go. Let the anger fade. Let the airline win with their non-apology and wait for the world to move on. But then what? Then it would happen again. To him. To someone else. To someone without millions of followers. His jaw clenched. No. Not this time. He started typing. They're waiting for this to blow over. They're waiting for people to forget. But this isn't just about me. This happens every day to people who don't have a platform to speak up. And that's exactly why I won't let this go. He hit post. Within seconds, the numbers surged again. The momentum was back, stronger than before. More people were sharing their stories. More people were demanding real answers. And this time, the airline couldn't ignore it. The statement came just an hour later, different from the first. This one said his name. We sincerely apologize to Mr. Vinícius Júnior for the incident that occurred at our boarding gate. We are reviewing our training policies and will ensure this does not happen again. But Vinícius wasn't impressed. Because this wasn't about training. This was about how the world worked. A world where black people in expensive cars still got pulled over. Where black people in luxury stores still got followed. Where black people in first class still had to prove they belonged. Training wouldn't fix that. But exposure could make it harder to ignore. And that's exactly what he was going to keep doing. The apology didn't sit right. Vinícius read it twice, 3 times, searching for something real in it. But it was just damage control, carefully worded to make the problem go away without actually fixing anything. He could feel it in his bones. They weren't sorry. They were sorry people saw it. And if that was the case, then he needed to make sure they couldn't look away. Because this wasn't just about him. This was about the kid dreaming of becoming a pilot, but wondering if the cockpit will ever truly welcome him. This was about the woman in a business suit who still gets second glances when she walks into a boardroom. This was about every single person who had ever been made to feel like an intruder in a space they had earned. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. The world was watching, but would they act? Vinícius opened his phone, scanning the messages flooding in. There were celebrities reaching out. Athletes, politicians, activists. But the ones that mattered most. The voices from regular people. People who didn't have millions of followers. People who had no way of making their own stories go viral. Until now. Vinícius started retweeting. Every story. Every testimony. Names that had never been in headlines before were now being seen. And the movement grew. By morning, it wasn't just an apology people were demanding. They wanted action. They wanted real change. And now, the airline wasn't just facing one player. They were facing the whole world. Morning came, but the fire hadn't died. If anything, it had spread. News stations were covering it. Not just sports outlets, global media. Headlines weren't just about Vinícius Júnior anymore. They were about systemic racism. About who gets questioned and who gets a free pass. About why this keeps happening. The airline tried again. Another statement. A bigger promise. We are committed to taking action. We will be implementing a new anti-discrimination policy, reviewing our hiring and training programs, and working with experts to ensure a more inclusive experience for all passengers. This time, it wasn't just words. They had no choice. The world was watching. But Vinícius knew better than to believe change would come just because a corporation felt pressured. This was bigger than one airline. Bigger than one incident. So he did something more. He reached out to organizations that had been fighting this battle long before his name was attached to it. He donated. He partnered. He used his voice to amplify theirs. Because he had something most people didn't. A platform. A reach so wide that the world had no choice but to listen. And he wasn't going to waste it. By the end of the week, the conversation had shifted. No longer just about an airport, or a security officer, or a hesitant boarding agent. It was about breaking the cycle. It was about making sure the next time a black man stood in first-class boarding, no one questioned if he belonged. Because this fight was just getting started. And the future wouldn't wait.